Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Vladimir Chuk. I'm Executive Director of the International Disability Alliance. As well, I am a co-chair of the GLAD network. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the three GLAD co-chairs, which is government of UK, Norway, as well as International Disability Alliance, to the GLAD high-level roundtable on disability and COVID-19. Before we begin, I would like to just share some of the main housekeeping rules. We have a closed captioning today, and it is placed in the chat box on the right side. As well, you can have a closed captioning embedded in the picture if you click on the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen. We also have provided international sign language. If you have any questions to plenarists, presenters, or to the GLAD Secretariat or GLAD co-chairs, you can please send those questions to the GLAD email address, which is also provided in the chat box. Thank you very much. So now I will begin a session. GLAD, or a Global Action on Disability, was established in 2015 as a donor coordination mechanism, which is tasked to promote disability inclusive development. I would like to sincerely thank you for coming to this event, which has a goal to once again strongly reconfirm our commitment to the disability inclusive development, a commitment to CRPD, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and to principle of leave no one behind, as well as to highlight the importance of including persons with disabilities in the response and the recovery process to COVID-19. Let me be frank at the beginning of this session. The very moment that this pandemic hit, the principles of leave no one behind, as well as reach the furthest behind, were quickly forgotten. According to research implemented by IDA, International Disability Alliance, persons with disabilities have been left to die, often not because they contracted COVID-19, but rather because they were left without support services and accessible communication, or were discriminated in the provision of the emergency healthcare. Following the lack of the immediate response, many stakeholders did engage in ensuring that persons with disabilities are part of the response to the pandemic. And here we would like to definitely recognize the United Nations Secretary General Policy Brief, as well as steps that WHO made to make its briefings more accessible, and many more stakeholders doing more and more work to include persons with disabilities. Today, as the world is transitioning into the new phase of this global crisis, we have a clear call to the governments around the world and all stakeholders to engage persons with disabilities and organizations of persons with disabilities in the recovery process, especially through implementing consultations. It's only through participation of persons with disabilities and their representative organizations that we can hope that the recovery phase of the pandemic is less discriminatory and more inclusive than what it was at the beginning of the response. Let's learn from the mistakes and do better in the next phase. That's why the 3 co-chairs of the GLAD are launching today a call to action. And we are inviting all of you that join this call to endorse it. You will receive the link in the chat box on the right side to this call to action. As well, all the participants of this event will receive email with the call to action. We are kindly inviting you to endorse it. Now, without further ado, I would like to start the official part of this session. And we will begin with the 6 minutes video message, which is compilation of a large number of short messages from disability rights leaders across the world. I will kindly ask for a video.
Great need for food, for PPEs, and just to help persons with disabilities so that they get through this situation.
It is the hunger, it is the risk of infection, it is also the lack of medical supplies, medical items. So when those are in shortage, I think that panics and that affects people more than the COVID-19 itself.
Coronavirus is currently a global disaster. Persons with disabilities are most at risk during this disaster. Because we have no personal protection. Then we have economic problems.
COVID's been a really difficult time for many of us living with mental health issues. The mental health service system hasn't been equipped to deal with a lot of our issues. There's been a lot more violence, a lot more isolation. There's been very limited access to support, such as therapy and peer support.
As a result of COVID-19, I had no income from here in last 5 months. So at present, we are suffering from extreme problems of food, medical care and shelter.
Children with hearing impairments were not able to follow lessons on radio like other children. The same for blind children that cannot follow on television. They need to be facilitated to access courses.
I cannot easily communicate with others. I totally depend on lip reading and facial expression. Using masks and maintaining physical distance hinder in my communication.
COVID has really affected me. More so, keeping the social distance with my guide has been a big challenge. And also accessing the sanitizers at the grassroots level has been a total mess because we cannot access them.
Access to accurate and timely information in this time of coronavirus is one of the greatest challenges faced by people with hearing impairments in Uganda and I'm sure some other parts of the world.
For world leaders, the simple message from me is that COVID-19 is testing our leadership styles, our leadership experience, and our leadership capacities. It is helping us to rethink how leadership is designed and how leadership is implemented.
I am seeking cooperation from all leaders for girls and women with disabilities for their livelihood and health protective service.
And we would definitely appreciate any intervention from any development partner that would mitigate the effects of COVID-19 or the coronavirus on persons with disabilities.
I wish to tell world leaders to operationalize the concept of leaving no one behind, to ensure communication, networking, compassion, participation and access are enhanced. World leaders to empower DPOs to be able to reach out to grassroots to deliver preventive and protective measures. After the COVID-19, I wish to see an inclusive recovery mechanism and measures which are completely inclusive to persons with disabilities regarding future calamities.
In the future, national governments and international organizations need to include deaf people and deaf-led organizations as an integral part of all emergency response plans, which center the use of national sign languages in all communications and health services.
We can't focus on human rights without a justice narrative and perspective.
The disability community should be inclusive. The leaders should embrace humanity and prioritize people and purpose. The world should enhance its disability-friendly programs, and an inclusive society should be a top priority.
So we persons with disabilities appeal to the United Nations and other government organizations to stand by us by reaching the victims who are crying out for psychosocial, materials, and financial support. We need reintegration and rehabilitation and sustainable lives as human beings.
I would want to see world leaders formulate policies that are inclusive to persons with disabilities, other than them being sidelined in this whole pandemic crisis.
We, hard of it, expect to be safe and secure, and we hope we would not face the same barrier again in the future disaster.
My recommendation on this pandemic is to transform crises into opportunities for PWDs by the implementation of vocational training, placing entrepreneurship as the best alternative of self-sustainability for PWDs on this region.
As leaders make decisions, they should not fear making broad and bold decisions for the world.
Thank you very much. These were really very powerful statements and very powerful messages. Now it's my greatest pleasure and greatest honor to welcome the Deputy Secretary General, Ms. Amina Mohammed. I would like to thank her for really incredible leadership in the promotion of the rights of persons with disabilities in the UN. She was scheduled to deliver the presentation herself until very late yesterday. Unfortunately, in the last moment, due to the changes in her schedule, she will instead be delivering a video message. So I am inviting now video message of Ms. Amina Mohammed.
Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, disability inclusion is a priority for the United Nations and central to the promise of the 2030 Agenda to leave no one behind. With the COVID-19 crisis, persons with disabilities are among the hardest hit. Even under normal circumstances, persons with disabilities were already less likely to access education, healthcare and livelihoods, or to participate and be included in the community. They are more likely to live in poverty and experience higher rates of violence, neglect and abuse. This is further exacerbated for those living in humanitarian and fragile contexts. The pandemic is intensifying these inequalities. COVID-19 has made it clear that we must act now to ensure the meaningful inclusion of persons with disabilities in our societies. Last year, the Secretary General launched the United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategy. The strategy is our commitment to achieving transformative and lasting change across the UN system. Since the launch of the strategy, we have made much headway at all levels. UN country teams in all regions have been working to ensure that the needs and rights of persons with disabilities are met, using COVID-19 as a watershed moment to recover better with more inclusion. We are closely working in collaboration with organizations of persons with disabilities, including women, in everything we do to empower and ensure the inclusion of persons with disabilities. We have established a UNCT accountability scorecard on disability inclusion, ensuring that we do all we can on the ground to ensure disability is inclusive. Building on this commitment, in May, the Secretary-General launched his policy brief on a disability-inclusive response to COVID-19. It outlines 4 overarching areas of action. 1, mainstreaming of disability in COVID-19 response and recovery. 2, accessibility of information facilities, services and programs. 3, meaningful consultation with and the active participation of persons with disabilities and their representative organizations. 4, establishment of accountability mechanism to ensure disability-inclusive COVID-19 response. Close to 150 member states have expressed their support for the Secretary-General's recommendations. We now need to follow up with urgent action. An emergency working group has been established to strengthen and support the work of the UN system, from headquarters to the field. Work is already underway with the SG Fund for COVID-19 to ensure disability inclusion is, and the UN country teams are required to take time to undertake assessments on how to effectively include persons with disabilities. Ladies and gentlemen, the daunting challenges we face today also provide opportunities to come together to support innovative approaches and share good practices and lessons learned. Our common goal is simple: to build a future that is inclusive and accessible to persons with disabilities. The GLAD network can play a critical role in driving disability inclusion in the decade of action in our journey towards the SDGs. Together with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, the 2030 Agenda is our compass. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we do need to reflect on our existing approaches and find innovative solutions to bring them in line with the provisions of these instruments and agreements. I count on GLAD's network continuing its efforts to promote collaboration among the stakeholders in development cooperation. And I count on member states to play their part in ensuring an enabling environment for upholding the rights of persons with disabilities. We must work to build a society that is just, inclusive, accessible, and resilient for everyone. When we secure the rights of persons with disabilities, we invest in our common future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and truly powerful speech, and especially last message that we are investing in our future. Thank you very much once again, Ms. Amina Mohammed. Now we will move to the next speaker, and I have the greatest pleasure to invite Dr. Ren Mingui, who is Assistant Director General for the World Health Organization. And we would like to sincerely thank WHO for everything that you are doing to include persons with disabilities in the briefings and in everything in the response of WHO to this pandemic. The floor is yours, Dr. Ren.
Thank you, Mr. Vladimir Cook. Distinguished representative ministers, dear colleagues and friends, I'm delighted to represent WHO at this very important roundtable. The COVID-19 pandemic is the most severe global public health crisis in the last 100 years. More than 9 million cases has now been reported to WHO, with more than 440,000 deaths. This toll has especially hit persons with disability. As a health crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated that indeed we were not prepared to live up to the aspiration of equality for the persons with a disability. The persons with a disability has the increased risk in contracting COVID-19, in developing severe symptoms of COVID-19, or dying from the disease, not being able to access essential health services, and have been poor health during and after outbreaks, whether or not they are infected with COVID-19. We have seen, for example, that when health systems has been overburdened in their efforts to provide care to large number of people in their response to COVID-19, particularly when faced with limited supplies of resources, persons with disabilities has frequently been left behind. Based on a survey conducted in my colleagues in WHO, covering 160 countries, we know that in more than 60% of the country, rehabilitation services has been disrupted. The disruption of this and other services can have devastating consequences for the persons with a disability. But we know the pandemic is so much more than a health crisis. It's an economic crisis, it's a social crisis, and in many countries, it is political crisis. Its effect will be left for decades to come, and there is risk that if we do not act now, the lives and livelihoods of persons with disability will once again be among the worst hit. Living up to the spirit and the mission of the Global Action on Disability Network, we need now more than ever to come together to make sure that persons with disability are now included in the COVID-19 response and the recovery phase, and in doing so, to further the principles reflected in the Convention of the Rights of Persons with a Disability. The World Health Organization therefore urges you, bilateral and multilateral donors and organizations, private sectors, and foundations to provide delicate funding to the agenda of equity of the persons with disabilities when planning and implementing your financial commitments for the persons, for the response and recovery phase of COVID-19. For example, when vaccine is made available, we need to explicitly commit to ensure that persons with a disability have access to it through the appropriate planning and funding. This pandemic is also a reminder for all of us that the time to prepare for emergency is before the crisis hit. All sectors of governments and public health communities, all professionals providing COVID-19 related care and general health care, as well as civil society, must look beyond the current public health crisis and consider how to build back better our health systems and our society so that they are more inclusive of persons with a disability. So with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ren Mingui. Thank you very much for WHO. And I agree, when vaccine is found, we need to find a way how those that are most marginalized will be able to receive it. I think that will be most important next step in the recovery process. Thank you. And thank you once again for joining us. It is now my greatest pleasure to hand over the moderation of this event to Ms. Diana Dalton, who is a Deputy Director of the Inclusive Societies Department from the UK Department for International Development. Diana, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Vladimir, and I'm very grateful. I hope everybody can hear and see me okay. I'm very grateful to have been invited to moderate this part of the session and to welcome a very distinguished panel of speakers. In DFID, we've been talking regularly with UK and Southern civil society organisations, including DPOs, about the emerging situation for people with disabilities in countries that are now really feeling the impact of this COVID pandemic. And we're really obviously keen to make sure that we're receiving in DFID real-time data, real-time information about the situation on the ground, and in particular the reach of national governments and of international actors to offer their support. And we're obviously very keen to know where the gaps are and to play our role in addressing those wherever possible. So this is a really exciting opportunity to hear from world leaders working in international development and humanitarian action, and to gain an insight into what they see as the challenges and opportunities when seeking to leave no one behind during this pandemic and its aftermath. So firstly, what I'll do is briefly introduce all of the 7 eminent speakers. We're delighted to have them with us, albeit virtually. Firstly, we're going to hear from Mr. Dag Inge Ulstein, Minister of International Development at Norway's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We'll then hear from our own Baroness Sugg, Parliamentary Under Secretary of State at DFID. And next, after that, we'll go to Mr. Kieran Cannon, who's the Minister of State in Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, who has specific responsibility for diaspora and international development. Fourthly, we'll hear from Elina Kalku, who's the Under Secretary of State for Development Policy, Middle East and Africa in Finland's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have His Excellency Mr. Mitch Fifield, Australia's Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the UN. Then Mr. John Taylor, who's President of the Wellspring Philanthropic Fund. And last but obviously not least, we have Miss Louise Cord, who's the Global Director for Social Development at the World Bank. So hopefully they're all ready. The question that they have been asked to focus their presentations on are how is your organisation ensuring that the COVID-19 response and recovery is inclusive of persons with disabilities, and how do we ensure that throughout the crisis we are delivering on our collective commitment to leave no one behind? So on that, I will firstly welcome to the floor Mr. Dag Inge Ulstein from Norway. Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Diana. And Excellencies, representatives of people with disabilities, Mrs. Mohammed, Dr. Mwingwi, and also fellow ministers, colleagues and partners, friends, I would like to thank the GLAD Network for inviting me to speak at this very important meeting. As we all know, we are living through once-in-a-lifetime events, and much of the progress we have made globally in the past 30 years or so is under serious threat. Many of us has used every available opportunity to talk about the progress we have made. Absolute poverty was widespread when I was born. It is now the exception. Most children all over the world, including girls, now go to school. Infant mortality has been more than halved over the last 30 years. There is no need to go on. You're all familiar with many success stories. But I've also talked about what we will still need to do to achieve our common vision of leaving no one behind. We must focus on vulnerable groups, including people with disabilities. One important step the Norwegian government has taken is to earmark funding for vulnerable groups. We have also substantially increased our support for people with disabilities and are working closely with civil society organizations and multilateral partners. As I said, many years of progress are now at risk. For the first time in my generation, absolute poverty could increase, wiping out much of what we have achieved. COVID-19 and the actions countries have taken to combat the pandemic are threatening the livelihoods of poor people. Tourists are not visiting national parks of Tanzania. Migrants who have lost their jobs have no money to send back to the families in Bangladesh. And women in the markets of Addis Ababa cannot sell their products. This is just some examples. Hunger has been on the rise for the last 4 to 5 years now. And because of the pandemic, the number of people going hungry could soon be doubled. As we know, COVID-19 is a major health crisis, but it's also a poverty crisis, a job crisis, and a food security crisis. And that is why extraordinary new action is needed. We must strengthen our health efforts, but also do more to get poverty reduction back on track. Global challenges can only be effectively dealt with through international cooperation, and Norway has increased its support to WHO. We also played a leading role in setting up CEPI to strengthen global capacity to develop new vaccines. And we are calling for vaccines to be fairly distributed once they are available. They need to get to the most marginalized one and critical health personnel in all countries. That is so crucial. The pandemic is a threat to us all, but some groups are harder hit than others. And this is why today's meeting is so important. I realize that people with disabilities are particularly hard hit both by the pandemic and by the measures taken to control it. We must remember that in many places, information about how to protect yourself from infection is not readily available to everyone. And social distancing may be a much more serious matter for people who were already more or less confined to their homes. We also have heard stories about outright discrimination in terms of access to testing. This is simply not acceptable. During this crisis, it is more important than ever that all countries meet their obligations under the CRPD. And Norway strongly support the call for action, and we will continue to focus on helping people with disabilities in our development cooperation efforts. As we all consider how to reorder our priorities, which I think we almost do, we must make sure that we strengthen and provide enough resources for the most vulnerable groups among us. Looking beyond the pandemic, I hope I will be able to invite you all to Oslo for the next Global Disability Summit. And this will build on the global work that was started in London in 2018. It will also help to shape the agenda for the post-COVID-19 period and how we can build back better and more inclusively. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for those words. We're going to move to Baroness Sugg now in the UK. Over to you, Baroness Sugg.
Thank you, Diana. And as you've introduced me, I'm going to take the opportunity to thank you and all the team at DFID who work so hard to ensure our work there is fully inclusive. And it's great to be here today and fantastic to see such high level representation on such an important topic. And it was really good to hear the direct requests from people with disabilities at the start of this meeting. Along with all of you, I'm deeply concerned about the impacts of this crisis on people with disabilities, on older people and other marginalised groups. And they're both disproportionately affected by the impacts of COVID-19 and of course at risk of being left behind by the response to it. So it's important that today we come together in a time of crisis like this. And it's nearly 2 years since the Global Disability Summit, which the UK, the International Disability Alliance and the Government of Kenya hosted in London. And as many of you will know, the summit was a significant event for the Disability Unit. It was a moment when we all came together, world leaders, government ministers, civil society, the private sector, and of course disabled people's organisations, to really build a united vision for development and humanitarian work that includes people with disabilities. That drive and energy brought about the summit was really unprecedented, resulting in 170 sets of commitments to achieve real change. I'm delighted that we'll be having the next summit in Oslo, and I look forward to seeing many of you there. But 2 years on from that summit, we are facing a global crisis which is having a disproportionate impact on people with disabilities. And as I say, it's more important than ever that we harness that spirit of partnership and collective action. At DFID, we're rising to the challenge of putting the poorest and most marginalised at the heart of our response. And our efforts on this agenda will continue when DFID merges with the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office later this year to become the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. I'm proud that the UK has announced £764 million of UK aid to support international efforts to combat COVID-19 and to mitigate its wider impact. And that funding will support people with disabilities. For example, through our Rapid Response Facility, Humanity and Inclusion is working in the Central African Republic to support people with disabilities and other vulnerable communities through a large-scale hygiene awareness campaign and adapted hygiene kits. We're partnering with Unilever to provide accessible information on hygiene practices and to address the physical barriers to health and water for people with disabilities and older people. And we're also urgently redirecting our existing programmes to be more responsive to COVID-19. Through our partnership with Sight Savers, we've already put out disability-inclusive public health messaging through radio broadcasts, including some specifically targeting older people in Nigeria. And the Disability Rights Fund has supported disabled people's organisations to advocate for the rights of people with disabilities within the COVID-19 response. And this is all vital work. We know that people with disabilities, women with disabilities, are at least twice as likely to experience gender-based violence than their non-disabled peers. And that risk will be exacerbated during the pandemic. So in Pakistan, for example, DFID supporting mechanisms to provide psychosocial support and referral services for women and girls. And our Women's Integrated Sexual Health Programme is providing information in accessible formats and supporting governments to meet the health needs of women with disabilities. Social protection, of course, is vital, and our experts are providing dedicated support to developing countries to really embed a disability approach into social protection responses. And we all know that collecting data, good data, is essential, and we're working with our partners to disaggregate data for the pandemic by disability. And that's really going to help us better understand and address the differences in exposure, treatment, and impact. This crisis and its aftermath is a huge challenge for us all, particularly those who are already marginalised and face existing barriers. We already know that taking a united approach across the international community is essential to realise the promise of the SDGs and the CRPD. And it's now essential in order to combat COVID-19 as well, that we build a stronger, more inclusive world going forward. I'm grateful to the Deputy Secretary General for showing leadership on this agenda and emphasising the importance of the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy and full implementation of the strategy and all our global commitments on disability inclusion is vital if we're to ensure an inclusive response and recovery going forward. And that's why DFID is pleased to support the call to action on ensuring a disability inclusive response to COVID-19. Let us take this opportunity to remember and reinvigorate the promises that we made. We must do all we can to make sure that people with disabilities are not left behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Baroness. And now I'd like to invite Mr. Kieran Cannon from Ireland.
Thank you, Diana, and good morning, good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be joining you today for this very important meeting. Thank you to the GLAD Secretariat for the invitation. GLAD's work is essential to increasing awareness of disability and influencing policies which ultimately impact on people with disability. Ireland ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities in 2018. And this weekend, it's likely that a new Irish government will be in place, and the draft programme for government, which my party and indeed others agreed to, that programme for government commits to new disability rights legislation. And in recent years, there's been a greater emphasis across Ireland's development cooperation and humanitarian assistance policies and programmes on upholding the rights of people with disabilities. And this new emphasis was made clear in Ireland's Policy for International Development, A Better World, which I launched last year. And that policy expresses Ireland's clear commitment to delivering on the promise of the SDGs and indeed addressing the rights and needs of vulnerable people, including those with disabilities. The SDGs require us to leave no one behind, and they also ask us to reach the furthest behind first. The injunction to reach the furthest behind first inform Ireland's approach to international development and our engagement as a member state of the European Union, as well as our advocacy within the United Nations and other international fora. Irish Aid, which is Ireland's international development programme, supports a wide range of civil society, bilateral and multilateral organisations engaging in health education and human rights, which specifically deliver for people with disabilities. This includes our important work in health system strengthening and our partnerships with Gavi and the Global Fund on vaccines and other childhood interventions, which ultimately help prevent disability. And given the links between conflict and disability, I attach importance to Ireland's work in conflict prevention and humanitarian response, and ensuring that people living with disabilities are at the centre of those responses. I hope, as an incoming member of the Security Council, that we can use our voice effectively and wisely to champion these people's needs. In recent months, we have all experienced the reinforcement of inequality provoked by COVID-19. It is clear that the world is facing not just a health crisis, but severe economic and social challenges. And these overlapping crises are reinforcing inequalities everywhere. In particular, they deepen the exclusion, which is the reality of too many of those living with disabilities around the world. We all recall the words of Dr. Mike Ryan of the WHO when he said that no one is safe until everyone is safe. That requires us all to lean in to support global efforts to reduce the incidence of the virus and mitigate its impacts on vulnerable populations. And today's discussion is a reminder that our efforts, both at home and in our international engagements, must have people with disabilities at the very centre of those efforts. Much of the advocacy regarding the international response to COVID-19 and the associated economic and social crises has highlighted the importance of a focus on women and girls. It is sadly too clear that there are specific impacts experienced by women and girls with disabilities, which our interventions seek to mitigate. I am committed to continued support for programs that specifically address these gendered impacts, in particular those that consider the needs of women and girls with disabilities. Ensuring supports are in place for elderly people living with disabilities is also vital. Education is something I am truly passionate about. I understand the value of education, and in particular the value of education to a child with disabilities. The global pandemic has left an estimated 1.5 billion children out of school, and we know the impact of this is likely to be worse for children with disabilities who now face an even greater risk of being left behind. But we can make a difference, and the pandemic serves as an opportunity for all of us to rethink how emergency education planning can be inclusive of children with disabilities. Through our civil society organisation funding, we are supporting a number of organisations which are working to help to target, access and indeed include children with disabilities back into education through accessible formats. And a key question facing people with disability is the continuity in the delivery of and access to health services. In addition to support for complex needs or rehabilitation, they need routine immunisation and nutrition support, critical sexual and reproductive health services. And many people with disabilities are also survivors of gender-based violence. And a couple of years ago, during a visit to Tanzania, I had the privilege to visit the comprehensive community-based rehabilitation hospital there, which is currently working hard to ensure a continuation of disability services. And I want to see greater consideration and integration of these supports across the range of Irish interventions and partnerships. That said, Ireland is steadily ramping up our work on disability. We now have a focal point lead working on the area of disability policy. Ireland is committed to the OECD DAC markers and have recently introduced a marker on disability. A comprehensive guidance note on the marker usage is being developed and will be communicated to all of our missions right around the world. And in so doing, I and my colleagues will be working with other parts of government, including Ireland's National Disability Authority, our Ministry for Health, and other centres of excellence to help guide all of that valuable work. I want to add my wholehearted support for the call to action, and I greatly look forward to hearing today's really essential discussions. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cannon. We're going to go to Finland now. Miss Elina Kalku, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you, GLAD Network, for organizing a very timely discussion on this important issue in very challenging times. For Finland, today's theme is a long-term priority for both human rights and development policy. A human rights-based approach, gender equality, and the principle of nothing about us without us guide our work. Right now, the consequences of the COVID pandemic are having a disproportionate impact on persons with disabilities. And we know that corona response does not adequately reach persons with disabilities. I would like to share some thoughts on the response. First of all, the pandemic has demonstrated how crucially important multilateral cooperation is for the response, in particular in crisis areas. System-wide efforts are key. Mainstreaming disability inclusion and accessibility into all programs and services are of critical importance now. My country will continue to support these efforts with our multilateral partners. The COVID-19 outbreak has highlighted the need for flexible, unearmarked, multi-annual development and humanitarian funding. Finland provides a substantial part of her support unearmarked. During the outbreak of the pandemic, it turned out that this helped our partners to quickly respond to the rapidly changing circumstances. Adjustments to our bilateral development programs have also been swiftly made. For instance, a WASH program in Nepal increased accessible hand washing facilities and constructed disability-friendly water supply systems and toilets in quarantine areas. Many Finnish NGOs and our long-term partners such as Abilis Foundation and Disability Partnership Finland adapted to the crisis quickly by organizing accessible information campaigns and materials, delivering hygiene products and masks, and providing cash and food assistance to persons with disabilities and their families. They had not been included in general distributions. International coordination mechanisms, precisely like Global Action on Disability, have demonstrated their key role in raising awareness and in bringing actors together in exceptional times. Finland continues as an active member of GLAD and a co-chair of its Humanitarian Action Working Group with UNICEF. My country has been championing the inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action for several years. We could never imagine what dimensions this could get during a pandemic. The adoption of the IASC guidelines in humanitarian action last autumn was a great achievement, and we will continue our efforts to implement them with partners. Looking ahead, it is clear that building back better calls for transformative and systemic changes in the ways our policies, services, communication, and information are formulated and delivered. As donors, we need to provide funding to both disability-specific interventions and to necessary capacity and structures for mainstreaming. Here I would like to underline the full implementation of UN Disability Inclusion Strategy. Finland's support and cooperation will continue with the UN Partnership for Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which has a unique role in disability inclusive UN COVID response at country level. Moreover, all development and humanitarian actors need to collect and use sex, age, and disability disaggregated data. This needs to be a systematic approach, and for us it has become a mandatory minimum requirement for all our ODA funding. The intersectional approach is important in responding to diverse realities and to multiple discrimination, and to make sure, for instance, that sexual and reproductive health and rights and relevant services are available also for women and girls with disabilities. 150 member states of the United Nations, including my country, signed a joint statement as a response to the UN Secretary General's policy brief, A Disability Inclusive Response to COVID-19. The Finnish Development Minister, together with his Nordic colleagues, put together an initiative of Nordic principles for building back better and greener, and they included disability. And finally, I would like to raise something hugely important, the participation of organizations of persons with disabilities. The need to consult with them cannot be highlighted enough. These organizations have been a lifeline for many individuals in times of crisis. With direct linkages to communities, such organizations have also provided with about the impact of COVID-19 to persons with disabilities and information that would not have been otherwise available. They can help to identify the needs, and they are a key partner in finding the right solutions. I sincerely thank you for this opportunity and look forward to an interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kalku. We're now going to go to His Excellency Mr. Mitch Fifield. Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Diana, and can I also acknowledge Vladimir the Great and the wonderful work that IDA does, and the UN Deputy Secretary General Amina, who has an incredible passion in this area and really drives the effort throughout the UN system. Wonderful to have so many ministers and colleagues with us, and thanks to the co-sponsors for bringing us all together. And I must say, it was nice to see Matthew from Australia on the video. It was very important that we have the voices of people with disability. So thank you for providing that video to us all. Friends, this is an important gathering because we don't pause often enough to reflect on the things that matter to people with disability. In particular, the vision of people with disability, the idea of nothing about us without us. It's still a work in progress. And I've got to say, at a personal level, once you've worked in this area, it grabs you. It never lets you go. And I had that experience as Australia's former Minister for Disabilities. This, I should mention, has also been the experience of Australia's Prime Minister, who's also had responsibility for the disabilities portfolio. And fortunately, for us, it's an area that's above politics. So that's just a little bit of background as to why Australia has such a commitment to disability inclusion at home and abroad. We get it. And we get that it matters in COVID-19 response and recovery. This is reflected in our new development strategy, Partnerships for Recovery, Australia's COVID-19 development response. It matters because people with disabilities are amongst the poorest and the most marginalised people in developing countries. And in times of crisis, pre-existing inequalities do tend to be exacerbated. During COVID-19, people with disabilities are at increased risk of developing more severe cases of COVID, coming up against barriers to life-saving relief and recovery, also being disproportionately affected by the socio-economic impacts and just plain being left behind. Now, to address this, to make sure no one is left behind, we've got to prioritise a rights-based approach to COVID-19. We've got to enable people with disabilities to be on an equal basis in response and recovery. Again, nothing about us without us. A disability responsive and inclusive approach has to include raising awareness of disability rights and inclusion amongst health workers and others who are responding, ensuring people with disabilities receive equal and non-discriminatory access to healthcare, including life-saving measures, providing public health information in a range of formats that are accessible. No good having the information there if you can't actually grab it and make use of it. And importantly, consulting people with disabilities and their representative organisations to make sure their needs are known. More immediately, for our part, we've recently provided $2.4 million to UNP RPD to support these efforts, including the second tranche of the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy. Just briefly, by way of background, in our humanitarian partnerships, we require our partners to mainstream disability inclusion, to disaggregate data and to provide targeted support to people with disabilities. And we continue to champion the IASC guidelines on inclusions of people with disability. Australia has also renewed its support to key international partners, including International Disability Alliance, the Pacific Disability Forum, and the Disability Rights Advocacy Fund, now more important than ever to make sure that they can adjust their work. Just one concrete example, Australian support has enabled information about COVID-19 to be distributed in accessible formats in Indonesia, Samoa, and the Solomon Islands. And I'll close on this point, which is an attitudinal one. And for those who've heard me speak about this before, please forgive me. But we can have the best policy, we can have the best programs, we can have the best funding, but it won't work and it will count for nothing unless we can lift our sights and lift our attitudes towards people with disability. What I'm talking about is what a former Australian Disability Commissioner referred to as the soft bigotry of low expectations. People with disability should be included, they want to be included, and they absolutely have what we need and the capacity to do so. Often, their biggest barrier is our attitudes. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Your Excellency. We would like to now welcome Mr. John Taylor, who is President of the Wellspring Philanthropic Fund.
Thank you for the kind introduction and for this opportunity to speak with you. I understand that my role today in today's lineup of speakers is to present a perspective from private philanthropy concerning disability and COVID-19. The private foundation that I represent, Wellspring Philanthropic Fund, is broadly concerned with advancing social justice. Since 2006, we have maintained a dedicated programmatic focus on advancing the rights of people with disabilities, and more specifically on supporting the full implementation of the CRPD. A key motivation for our work in this area stems from the pervasive marginalization, discrimination, and social exclusion faced by the world's billion-plus people with disabilities, which affect almost every aspect of life: birth registration, legal capacity, educational opportunity, sexuality, family formation, employment, leisure, political participation, health, and life expectancy. We believe that work in this area materially improves the lives of very large numbers of people, and these people matter. We were also motivated by a conviction that the systemic devaluation of the lives and experience of people with disability undermines the principle of universal human dignity and weakens respect for human rights generally. By working to advance the human rights of people with disabilities, we hope to strengthen the foundations for human rights more broadly. In fact, the CRPD recognizes that while all human beings are equal in dignity and worth, we are different from each other in our particular capacities and needs. The CRPD posits that disability occurs not within the individual person, but at the interface between the individual and the built and social environment, and that a society committed to the realization of human rights and the fulfillment of human potential must go beyond formal non-discrimination and must affirmatively engineer its built and social environment to promote the widest possible inclusion. In its recognition of human diversity and its conception of a society's responsibility to affirmatively extend itself, promote inclusion, the CRPD provides a compelling frame for thinking about how human rights should be advanced more broadly in a pluralistic, interconnected global civilization. Our approach as a funder is not to try to micromanage efforts around narrow outcomes, but rather to support a robust and interconnected ecosystem of civil society organizations led by people with disabilities and capable of challenging systemic exclusion, influencing global, national, and subnational policy agendas, and reshaping social norms. Most of our grants are unrestricted or are structured with sufficient flexibility to allow grantees to pursue their own agendas and to pivot as needed to meet opportunities and challenges as they arise. We coordinate our efforts with other private and public funders, and we strive to be a reliable partner, supporting many of our grantees over periods of many years. I think these qualities of flexibility, coordination, and reliability are especially important in the current dynamic context. As we have heard, the present corona crisis, which includes the pandemic as well as the associated economic dislocations, is acting like a global stress test, revealing existing weaknesses in our civilization's critical systems and drawing existing inequalities into stark relief. People who have faced discrimination, marginalization, and insecurity, including but not limited to people with disabilities, have borne much of the brunt of this crisis in the form of increased vulnerability to infection, increased susceptibility to poor outcomes from infection, special vulnerability to the interruption of critical support services, and limited resiliency in the face of the global economic downturn. The pain from this crisis is sufficiently widely felt, and the systemic weaknesses it reveals are sufficiently obvious to open up new conversations that were unthinkable just a few months ago about the nature of the social contract and the right ordering of society. It is imperative that people with disabilities, through their civil society organizations, have voice, not only in the shaping of the immediate response to the present crisis, but in shaping the larger conversations it has opened about the society we will be going forward. In centering the voices of people with disabilities within these conversations, we center the values of inclusion and equity, which are precisely the values that we must better center for our civilization to move forward from this moment. Thank you.
Sorry, muted for a moment then. Thank you very much, Mr. Taylor. And to our final speaker, it's Ms. Louise Cord from the World Bank. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Diana. It's a real pleasure to be here to address this honorable and very distinguished group of speakers. The bank has been an active supporter and member of the GLAD network and is very committed to remaining a key partner and strengthening this relationship. The high-level roundtable on disability and COVID-19 comes at a critical time. As was mentioned earlier, there's been an increase in poverty. We expect to see extreme poverty rise from 70 to 120 million new poor. This is the first time we'll have seen an increase in the poverty rate since 1998. And we know that the disabled, who make up roughly 15% of the global population, will be a disproportionate share of those who are poor or who are vulnerable to falling into poverty. Even under normal circumstances, persons with disability face less access, as we know, to education, to healthcare, and income-generating opportunities, and are more likely to experience higher rates of gender-based violence and other forms of neglect and abuse. But clearly, as have been said by the speakers before me, with COVID-19, new challenges have emerged. It's even more difficult for children with disabilities to get access to education under the remote and online methods that are being used. Others face a loss of workplace support and opportunities to be able to engage in employment. Healthcare services have become more rationed and often difficult for those with disabilities to get some of the basic healthcare services that they need to be able to function well. Overall, at the bank, we're taking a large response to COVID. 160 billion will be invested over the next year in fighting and supporting countries to cope with COVID at the level of healthcare, fiscal support, programs with the private sector, and a large component of that will also be around what we're calling the social response, which is how do you put more money, more food support, food security, income, livelihoods opportunities, care services down to the level of the vulnerable communities. We know that communities are often the first order responders to COVID and its related impacts, and there's a need to strengthen the ability of communities to deal with the many impacts, and in particular to integrate and support the more vulnerable, including the disabled. Specifically on disability, I'd like to highlight three broad areas where the World Bank is currently engaging related to COVID. First is on the knowledge side and information side. Second will be on the operations side. And third is what we're doing in partnerships. So on the knowledge side, we've prepared a lot of internal notes looking at what are the issues that could be facing those with disabilities so that our staff in the region are able to adapt their projects, their policy dialogue to be taking into account the special needs of the disabled. We're also looking at the impacts of the specific impacts of the crisis on those with disabilities. For example, we're doing a survey in Latin America to understand how the disabled are being impacted and preparing issues notes that lay out some of these critical impacts. We've also done internal learning events, and we were fortunate to be able to host Ms. Catalina de Vandas Aguilar, the UN Special Rapporteur for Rights of Persons with Disabilities, at an internal learning event to raise the visibility of this issue with our staff working on projects on the front line to make sure it gets integrated into their work. Let me now turn to what we're doing on the operations side. As I mentioned, we have a large operational support overall in the bank, and we want to make sure that it's focused. Our operations are focused on meeting the needs of those with disabilities. So a good example are recent projects in Rwanda and DRC, which look at specifically, in addition to addressing the impacts of COVID and how to support the system more broadly, how to make sure that children with disabilities are continuing to access education opportunities. Same on our health projects. We also have done a lot. As you know, the World Bank requires consultations as part of preparations of the projects. We've moved to online consultations during COVID and made special efforts to integrate the voices of groups and individuals with disabilities into those online consultations. Disability is also a cross-cutting theme in IDA 19, which starts next week. And we are rapidly putting together a monitoring system to be able to make sure that all of our commitments across the global practices, the sector global practices, are met on disability. When it comes to partnership, we have a senior partnership. We have a senior disability advisor, Charlotte McLean Napo, and she is leading our work on the workstream funding with the UN Task Force on Persons with Disability that was set up by the Undersecretary General Ana Maria Menendez. And further to that, we are planning a session with our CSO partners specifically on disability to discuss what we're doing and to get their feedback. So in wrapping up, in conclusion, I'd like to say that as the Global Director for Social Inclusion and Sustainability, disability is a central part of our strategy. Never before has it been so critical for the World Bank to be engaged in this area. We set up a specific separate global practice last year looking at that. We have more than 300 staff working on issues of inclusion and social sustainability at the bank. Both looking at disability, which includes looking at disability as a standalone challenge and how we can integrate it better into our projects, but also looking more broadly at how challenges of inclusion for all vulnerable groups, Indigenous peoples, LGBTI, the elderly, women at risk of violence, how we can better serve them in our operations across the World Bank. So with that, thank you very much for this invitation. And I look forward to further collaborating with you on this important agenda. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Louise. That was great. And thank you to all of our panelists today. We're concluding this session there. Can I just apologize to anybody whose name I mispronounced or any job titles that I got wrong. All contributions have clearly conveyed a determination to act. We've heard that loud and clear, and also to cooperate on the response to this hugely disruptive pandemic. They're united on understanding the risks of not doing enough for persons with disabilities, and all acknowledge clearly that the world will not build back better if there's not a true focus on leaving no one behind. Measuring better, both in human terms as well as economic terms, is a critical way forward. So I'll conclude there, and I'm now going to hand over to John Lemoy, who is our co-chairing partner from Norway's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who will take over the moderation from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diana, and thanks to the speakers in this important session. We're now moving on to a session where we have invited 5 interventions from the floor. Of course, virtual floors is a challenge, so whether it's floor or space, we can consider. But we have 5 speakers with us, and I'm happy first to invite Mr. Robert Adestro, Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor from the U.S. Department of State. Mr. Adestro, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, and thank you, or good afternoon for those of you who are in other time zones. Thank you for having me this morning. Thank you, Mr. Lemoy, and I really am honored here to be here with all of you to speak about an issue that's been close to my heart and to my experience for many years. It's also central to American foreign policy, and that is the inclusion of persons with disabilities in every aspect of life. The US government is committed to protecting the human rights of persons with disabilities, including during the global response to COVID-19. Both the US Department of State and USAID maintain COVID-related task forces and working groups whose primary purposes are to track abuses and to use the data that we gather to shape policies that promote democratic and human rights, primarily by demanding accountability for behavior that isolates or otherwise ignores our mutual obligation to ensure that every person is equally protected by the law. As such, we believe that the following policies are essential for an effective global response. First and foremost, and it's certainly obvious to all of us, but I think that the behavior we've seen recently shows that we need to do some work, is that persons with disabilities are not objects. Like everyone else, they must be active participations in the planning, implementation, and evaluation phases of every single program. We need to make sure not only that the policies meet their needs, but when the program is over, we need to know whether or not they actually did. A pandemic must never, ever be used as an excuse for limiting access to any kind of diagnostic and treatment, social services, or to healthcare or social services facilities. One of the points I've tried to make to our staff at the State Department is that this COVID epidemic has really underscored the human dimension of what we call the human dimension of human rights. Women and girls who are isolated. I mean, all of us have been isolated, but women and girls who have been isolated with abusive partners or other household members during these times face the heightened risks of domestic violence and partner violence. People with mental disabilities are isolated, and we're seeing all kinds of mental health problems as a result of this. We need to be paying closer attention. And as the introductory video, I think, so well pointed out, we know how COVID-19 disproportionately affects people with disabilities. The data on persons held in institutions is, in my view, both unacceptable and scandalous. The number of deaths among the elderly in residential facilities is a scandal that will, I believe, in time grow worse. And the fact that the most vulnerable were not protected, in my view, demands accountability. Our diplomatic efforts to assistance budget from the Department of State and USAID access to U.S. government-funded goods and services. Our foreign assistance program provides equal access to medical care and social services, regardless of gender, disability, religion or belief, race, ethnicity, or sexual orientation. All these efforts are further buttressed by engagements with multi-stakeholder organizations like the GLAD Network, as well as the UN, which enables the sharing of promising practice, data, consensus building, and a unified voice on these important issues. We were pleased to sign on to the joint statement with more than 140 other countries in response to the Secretary General's appeal to include persons with disabilities in COVID recovery and response. And I would just add, as an aside, I hope that down the road, as we work together, that won't be something that we need to even talk about. It should just be done as a matter of course. We're also integrating language on persons with disabilities across the General Assembly and other UN efforts related to COVID, including the omnibus resolution that's currently being negotiated in New York. Now, although our work seems heavy now as we face the immediate outfall of the pandemic, we must also turn our focus to second order effects. It's critical to prepare and mitigate and address second order economic, civilian security, stabilization, and governance impacts of COVID-19, in part to prevent development and democratic backsliding. I can just, my heart went out to the kids that they mentioned in the introductory video, especially the kids that they talked about in Rwanda who couldn't hear and they couldn't see the TV. How do they continue their education? There's an obligation to remedy all that. And as I said at the GLAD Network meeting back in February, persons with disabilities need to be at the table, working side by side with all of us, governments, donors, businesses, and civil society. All these voices are necessary. And I'm not going to say anything more about that. I think I will now turn the microphone back to Mr. Lemoy, and thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you, Robert, for those important words. I'm now going to turn to Mr. Donald Brown, Associate Vice President of the International Fund for Agricultural Development. Mr. Brown, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning, afternoon, and evening, distinguished participants, excellencies. On behalf of Gilbert Hongbo, the President of IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, we're very happy to be able to participate in this meeting and share our experiences about COVID responses. So maybe I should start by saying in 2019, to try and get a better targeting of people with disabilities in IFAD's projects, we published a report based on our analysis of persons with disabilities and IFAD interventions. And the report, which was called Economic Activities of Persons with Disabilities in Rural Areas, New Evidence and Opportunities for IFAD, has also been very useful, not in just building in the recommendations into our new projects, but also into thinking about our COVID response. And obviously, like others, IFAD recognizes that persons with disabilities are disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 outbreak. And so we have a responsibility to ensure that as part of our response, a vital part is to ensure that they are properly included and we leave no one behind. So central to the way we've responded to COVID is using IFAD's existing robust targeting strategy and data systems, which are already in place from our normal development projects, and using them to ensure that as part of our response, we can identify and include not only the poorest and most marginal, but also people with disabilities as part of that key group. So priority is being given in our COVID response to addressing those that are disproportionately impacted. And our operational response for COVID-19 has had 4 key areas of which we've applied a disability lens. The first one is we have been restructuring a number of our existing projects. In fact, over 60 of our projects, totaling about 140 million US dollars. We've used money in those projects to repurpose for a COVID response, and we've applied a disability lens to those repurposing to ensure that they are properly targeted. Secondly, we've had a rapid response rural stimulus facility that we launched, priority being given to those that are those countries and those groups highest at risk for falling back into poverty and food insecurity as part of COVID, including persons with disabilities. And a good example of a COVID project that we are just starting in Sierra Leone, for example, is focused on women and persons with disabilities as the key target groups, because our targeting analysis in Sierra Leone say that these are most affected. And one aspect of that is particularly looking at vegetable value chains, not only because they are extremely important for women and people with disabilities, because they are not heavy physical work. They often can be done with easy access to the household, but particularly as part of COVID, the nutritional imbalances we're seeing due to lack of access and availability of food means vegetables become increasingly important, both for the household and both in terms of being able to sell on and provide income for the households. Our third area that we've been working on is ensuring that public policy responses for COVID are particularly focused on the most marginalized, including people with disabilities. And so far, we've funded about $500,000 worth of analysis and practical field assessments to ensure the targeting is right in over 23 countries responding to government requests. And then the last area is ensuring that as part of this process, but also in accelerating recovery, we ensure that persons with disabilities' voices are thoroughly reflected in the debate. And as part of that, IFAD is participating with other UN agencies in the Interagency Working Group on Persons with Disabilities. And what we are doing is we will be launching in about at the end of 2021 or 2022 a new strategy for IFAD on targeting persons with disability within our projects. And we will be taking the learning from the COVID response as part of that to ensure that is properly integrated in the new strategy. So maybe in summary, we recognize the importance of targeting persons with disabilities in the COVID response. We apply that lens, being able to mine our existing data on targeting. And we feel that the working group, as well as the new strategy, will help us to build back better. With that, I'd like to thank you for our participation.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. It's now my pleasure to turn the floor to His Excellency Ambassador Luis Galagos, Permanent Representative of Ecuador to the United Nations in New York. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Distinguished moderator and panelists, dear friends and colleagues, I hope that you are all well despite the international crisis that spans every border, affects every nation, but more so affects every individual in a life and death situation. The crisis is so profound in health, economic, and social issues that it will change the way the world functions, and the way we used to know the world functioned is not the way of the post-pandemic. Thank you for the invitation to participate at this important event. I would like to congratulate the co-chairs of the Global Action of Disability, the UK Department for International Development, the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the International Disability Alliance for this initiative that recalls our commitments established through the 2030 Agenda, in particular during this pandemic, that has highlighted the vulnerability of persons with disabilities who suffer disproportionately from economic hardships and health-related issues. As President of the Conference of State Parties of the CRPD, I welcome the opening remarks of the UN Deputy Secretary Amina Mohammed. We need to work and collaborate with determination in order to leave no one behind. The COVID-19 epidemic is a stark reminder of the need for equal and inclusive societies that respect and value diversities and differences. As you may recall, the UN Secretary General's policy brief, A Disability Inclusive Response for COVID-19, was issued in early May to address the situation. A total of 146 member states expressed their strong support to be one of the leaders in garnering that support. Now we must continue to implement the recommendations of the UN Secretary General in alignment with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities so that we can build back better toward the achievement of a sustainable development goals, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and other global commitments. We must do so in solidarity. Our collective efforts must promote the well-being of our societies as well as foster peace and security in the world. We must ensure the inclusion and access of persons with disabilities to health services on an equal basis with others, including medicines, vaccines, and medical equipment, as well as critical information that is available in accessible formats. Moreover, the meaningful consultation and active participation of persons with disabilities and their representative organizations in all stages of COVID-19 response and recovery are an imperative, among many other measures that put persons with disabilities at the center of our efforts. Furthermore, Ecuador supports the call for the COVID-19 vaccines to be deemed a
Thank you, Your Excellency. There was some problems with the transmission at the end, but I hope we all got your important messages. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor to Mrs. Anna Terron, Director of the Fundación Internacional y para Iberoamérica de Administración y Política Públicas. And excuse me from the onset for my lack of, for my bad pronunciation of Spanish. Mrs. Anna Terron, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Your Spanish is excellent. I will try with my English, by the way. Thank you very much, Mr. Lamoy, to your kind presentation. And thank you very much, all of you, dear Deputy Secretary General, family of UN, dear ministers, dear Executive Director of ITA, dear colleagues. I think this has been a very, very interesting exchange, very timely and very meaningful. I completely agree that both COVID-19 response and recovery need to be disability inclusive and based on the right of persons with disability. Despite the challenges caused by COVID to disability inclusive international development, we do have a window of opportunity. Let me talk a little bit of my organization. Our main intervention, coordinated by us, by FIAP, is the EU-funded project Bridging the Gap, which supports socioeconomic inclusion in 5 low and middle income countries, by the way, in Latin America and Africa, and I'm very happy of this mixture of the program. We really enjoy cooperation within Bridging the Gap. Bridging the Gap has been supporting enhancements of a more inclusive cooperation culture in our organization. And it's also, and that's very interesting for us, supporting through other EU programs, Eurosocial, sorry. and Evalua. I'm sorry. Can I jump it back? Sorry so much. Can I come back later, please? I have a problem.
Yes.
I come back in. Okay, no, it's better now. Sorry for that.
Would you be able to continue, madam?
Can I come back in after the next intervention, please?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. Let me then invite Mr. Dominic Haslam, the chair of the International Disability and Development Consortium, IDDC, to take the floor.
Thank you, Jon, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to all of you. My name is Dom Haslam, and I'm representing the 30 NGO and DPO members of the International Disability and Development Consortium. Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to contribute to today's highly timely discussion. And very good to see so many friends and colleagues on this call today. COVID-19 has not created vulnerability among people with disabilities. It has instead shone a clear spotlight on the marginalization and discrimination faced by 1 billion people around the world in their homes, their communities, schools, places of work, and every other aspect of human interaction. This is a stark reality, but it also provides an opportunity. The very interruption and in many cases devastation caused by the pandemic to health, education, legal and even political systems, to economies and trade, provides a unique opportunity, and we can and must build back better. The leadership shown by the UN Secretary General in setting up the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, the World Health Organization Director General in committing to accessible communications, and by many governments such as the UK, Norway and Australia in committing to significant and ongoing financial support for disability inclusive development, demonstrates that such a change is possible. We need to build on this progress, embed change, and bring others along with us. There are 182 parties to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Sound national disability policies and plans are beginning to be in evidence around the world, but implementation and accountability remain patchy. This crisis comes with significant threats, as we've all experienced over the last weeks and months. And in line with the GLAD Network's mandate, we must work hard to ensure people with disabilities are included in all COVID response programs in developing countries. The GLAD Network must demonstrate our leadership in this area, calling on others to do more and ensuring that all of our own responses are inclusive. Some examples of that are already happening and have been shared by other speakers today, and we welcome those. Central to this effort must be community and national level organisations of persons with disabilities. And perhaps now is the time for the GLAD Network to reconsider a working group on health. Alongside responding to these threats, we must also be open to the opportunity that as economies reopen, schools and health services restart, and living with COVID becomes just another aspect of the human experience, we can and we must ensure that inclusion is the default, not an addition in these efforts. The GLAD Network has a powerful opportunity to influence and ensure this agenda. As was achieved with the UN CRPD and the Sustainable Development Goals, we must work harder than ever to ensure that in the post-COVID pandemic world, it is a more inclusive and a more equal world. As IDDC, we promise to work constructively with all GLAD members as representatives of civil society committed to disability inclusive development. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mrs. Theron, would you be able to resume your speak now, or should we move on?
Thank you, Chairman. Here I am. I'm so sorry. This is also a post-COVID effect. As all works restarted, I have crazy works on the streets, and I breathed a piece of something that was really, it made me difficult to speak at that moment. Sorry for that. I was telling you that we are very, very proud of working in the area of disability as an international cooperation organization. And we are very much happy that we can put together different kinds of programs like Eurosocial, Socio, Evalua, legal support to work with that. I will end with this idea because for me it's been very, very important and interesting. We could give some concrete work in this COVID pandemic. We've been working in Ethiopia, in Paraguay, in Sudan, in Paraguay. These projects and the inclusion of persons with disability is growing in importance in FIAP activity, in line of the overall commitment of the Spanish cooperation to the full implementation of CRPD. Our approach is multidimensional, is focusing on intersectional inequalities, mainly those due to disabilities and gender. And this is, as I said, very important because it makes us work together in different areas and combine different tools. FIAP approach is based on public technical assistance and peer-to-peer learning. We joined GLAD very recently. I think it is very important for an international cooperation agency as we are to be fully involved in your family. Let me end with this very personal note. We are happy to be part of this very family. We, my organization, but also I, are very much learning from you. My organization is better now, and I look forward to continue this work and to devolve as much as we can. Thank you very much. And sorry for the inconvenience of my intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I'm so glad that you recovered and were able to deliver your important messages to all of us. We are now moving towards the end, and we are happy to invite the chair of IDA, Mrs. Ana Lucia Arielo Barba to give the closing remarks. But before I do that, I would just like to thank all speakers and participants, and to particularly thank my fellow co-chairs, Vladimir and Penny, and the incredible staff at the GLAD and IDA Secretariat who's made this possible. With those words, the floor is yours, Anna.
Thank you very much, John. Good morning. Greetings from Quito, Ecuador, Latin America. Dear Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to start my speech by thanking all the moderators, panelists, and speakers from the floor for their time, amazing deliberations, and even commitments to sustain the political will on including persons with disabilities in the rebuilding process. This has been an incredible moment to exchange our possibilities, to redesign inclusive recovery from the pandemic, and most importantly, to scale up what we have done so far with the spirit of leaving no one behind. The global COVID-19 pandemic has put a true mirror in front of humanity, reflecting what we have achieved so far in creating an inclusive and equal world for all. And as we know, the image we find in that mirror is not always a pleasant one. In particular, the pandemic revealed how in face of a real crisis, the most marginalized and excluded are being re-excluded and re-marginalized first and foremost. For the community of persons with disabilities, the global pandemic was the opportunity to test the strength of commitments to disability inclusion, accessibility, and equality. And as the chairperson of the International Disability Alliance, the organization representing persons with disabilities from all regions and groups, I have to inform you that despite some heartwarming initiations and steps, the overall outcome of this test was not a positive as we were hoping for. In many countries around the globe, persons with disabilities were first who lost their employment and income, were among the last who received accessible information about the pandemic. Let me give you an example of how an inclusive approach without extra costs or expertise could prevent lots of barriers and difficulties that persons with disabilities are experiencing during the pandemic. Many countries around the world introduced lockdown rules excluding essential services, but they never included services needed by persons with disabilities among them. Consequently, a person who used a wheelchair could not get his wheelchair fixed because the government did not consider wheelchairs essential. Another person with their blindness was totally disconnected from the world because the authorities did not remember that for many persons with their blindness, in-person tactile interpretation is the only means of communication available. Dear Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, despite all these challenges, there are some unique opportunities available right now. And it's on us not to miss this momentum. While all governments, international organizations, and the civil society are working hard to build back a better future, we have the opportunities to learn from our shortcomings more than from our achievements. A better future must indeed be an inclusive future. The pandemic taught to all of us that none of us will be protected until every single person is protected. Persons with disabilities have shared with us what has happened to them. They have also shared practical, cost-effective solutions to avoid all these challenges from happening again, or new challenges during the transition and recovery phases. The only thing we must do is to give them the floor, listen to them, and let them guide us how to include them and benefit from their unique input. And that's exactly why we created the GLAD Network. The current crisis is an unprecedented wake-up call, which also gives us the opportunity to rethink the world we aspire to see and live. We are given the opportunity the one to deconstruct all the systematic inequalities and build back better. Building back better means building a more inclusive and resilient society which values and embraces diversity in its all forms. Following this high-level roundtable, the International Disability Alliance, along with the other co-chairs of the GLAD network, DFID UK and Government of Norway, would like to put forward a call to action to rebuild a future inclusive of all. This call to action is for all key stakeholders, including governments, international and regional intergovernmental organizations, the private sector, foundations, and civil societies, as well as organizations of persons with disabilities. I would like to take this opportunity to encourage all actors to endorse this call to action and be part of the process which strives to honor commitments of leaving no one behind and deliver tangible actions for the inclusion of more than 1 billion persons with disabilities. Dear Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I want to end by highlighting that in this new era of global crisis, the unified efforts to support persons with disabilities and their representative organizations to advocate for their rights and communicate their experience and calls must be duplicated, not reduced. This is the only safe path available to ensure an inclusive future for all the humanity. I thank you very much for your kind attention. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Anna. And with this, we would like to thank you all for joining us for this webinar, and we wish you a nice day. And once again, inviting you to endorse our call to action. Thank you very much. With this, meeting is over.